Hi, and welcome to Gnostic Warrior Radio, broadcasting from GnosticWarrior.com in San Diego, California, to around the world. This is episode number 14, and I'm excited to have an author from the UK named Ralph Ellis. He has authored several books, with his latest being Jesus, King of Edessa. He's an expert in alternative history, a fascinating gentleman. I've listened to several interviews on the internet of him, and it's going to be a great show. If you're interested in this type of material, please visit GnosticWarrior.com. For my past episodes, I have Jordan Maxwell and also Michael Tellinger and several other great guests that you'd be interested in checking out. We also have articles in alternative history that we're putting out daily, so please check that out at GnosticWarrior.com. Great. How you doing today, Ralph?
Hi, yeah, very well, thank you. The sun's out at last. We've had such a miserable spring this spring, but it's looking fine today.
Where are you located?
I'm over in Northern Europe at present, but I tend to be fairly mobile, so we've had a fairly miserable spring, but yeah, things are looking up.
Great, and it's great to finally have you on my show. I've been listening to you for the past year. I first found you on Red Eyes Creations with Henrik, who's been, of course, one of the four leaders of the podcast and radio and this type of field. And you know, I was really fascinated by what you had to say, because it's alternative history to what we've been told. And what I'd like to do before we get into what you do, you said where you're from. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, where people could find your website and stuff like that?
Essentially, I'm based in Britain, I suppose, so I've been researching out of Britain for about the last, 20 years or more. I started this way back, I suppose, when I was probably about 15, so that's probably, that's going on 40 years ago now. So I've been interested in this sort of subject for a long, long time, and slowly researching to start with, and then about 20 years ago picked up, and we're now into 11 books, I think. I think it's 11 books, might be 10, I forget now. So I'm going now more electronic, so obviously previously all the books were printed. But for the small publisher point of view, and from the researcher point of view, where you update your books fairly often, the e-book market is very, very useful. So most of the books now are going electronic. You can get the links from my website, which is edfu-books.com. That's EDFU, edfu-books.com. And obviously you can now get them from Amazon and from Apple and so on. So the main titles you want to look out for are Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs, Cleopatra to Christ, King Jesus, and Jesus, King of Edessa. So if you look up those and equally look up my name, Ralph Ellis, you will be able to find all of the books there. There's two main series of books. There's the Old Testament books, which go by the sort of brand name of the Egyptian Exodus, and then there's the New Testament ones, the recent trilogy, which is the King Jesus trilogy, and that sort of sums up the whole of the New Testament. So it depends which you're interested in, really.
Yes, Jesus, King of Edessa would be your latest book,
That's
correct?
the latest one, yeah. That's the blockbuster. Well, I hope it'll be the blockbuster. That's the one that actually identifies exactly who Jesus was, so you can actually go and have a look at his statue, and have a look at his coins, and have a look at his, the remains of his palace and so on. So, yeah, that's a very interesting book.
Does this book kind of coincide with your other book, Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs?
Yes. They're all somewhat based upon each other. It all started essentially with Jesus Last of the Pharaohs, which was a look at the entire biblical story all the way from virtually Genesis all the way up to the New Testament. So obviously, although that looked at the New Testament, it was only a matter of 2 chapters or so. Having said that, what it actually said was quite groundbreaking, because the main point of that book was saying that Josephus Flavius, the first century historian, was actually, I'm just losing my thread here, Josephus Flavius, the first century historian, was actually Saul, St. Paul. And I didn't actually prove it at that point because it was only 2 chapters in one book, but it seemed obvious to me at the time. And that is a conjunction of characters which changes the entire New Testament story, because it means the New Testament story has to be based in the AD 60s. In other words, the rebellion that Jesus was involved in was actually the Jewish revolt. So that changes the entire story. And it just seemed pretty obvious to me when I wrote it that that's exactly how it should be. But obviously I didn't prove it within 2 chapters. So then I went back and restarted that whole story again with Cleopatra to Christ, and then King Jesus, and then Jesus King of Edessa. And yes, what I said all the way back then, which is, I don't know, 15 years ago or more, actually turned out to be true. You know, everything I've looked at since confirms what I said in the first place, that Josephus Flavius is Saul, St. Paul, and therefore the entire story is changed. And the reason that was important was because if Saul is Josephus Flavius, then we have a lot more information about the biblical Jesus than people think. Because everybody says, oh, you know, there is no evidence for the biblical Jesus. Well, that's convenient, let's say. They don't want to find the evidence because the evidence is not the sort of evidence they want. The evidence contradicts the story they've been telling. So they don't want to find the evidence for the historical Jesus. But once we identify Saul as Josephus, Josephus talks constantly about Jesus. Okay, it's supposedly a different Jesus. They like to think that it's a different Jesus. But the main adversary of Josephus Flavius is a man called Jesus, Jesus of Gamala. And of course, the main adversary of Saul is Jesus, the biblical Jesus. If you remember the famous quote, you know, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? So there is a direct comparison between these 2 characters and the 2 histories they're writing. Saul is persecuting Jesus, and Josephus Flavius is persecuting Jesus. Now, if those 2 Jesuses are the same person, which obviously I've proved to my satisfaction that they are, then that not only changes the story, it means we have a lot more information to go on, because Josephus Flavius writes continually about this particular Jesus. And so we have an enormous amount of information about the biblical Jesus, if you dare understand that that is who he was, because obviously the story conflicts with standard Christian teaching. Because this... Sorry, go ahead.
Do you believe that, of course, the churches knows this, the Catholic Church, and they're just keeping this behind the closed doors?
Because it's not difficult to find out. You know, I'm not a religious scholar as such. I'm just a reasonably educated person who has an interest in these subjects. And it's not that difficult to find out this information. It's not very difficult to make the connections. The connections are pretty obvious. The only thing that gets in the way of these connections is if you have a preconceived idea about who this Jesus guy should be. And then, of course, you can't touch it. And
the people that have this preconceived idea, it's just based on religion and what is told to them. They have done, most of them, 99% of the people have not done their own research.
Yes, but it's not even because you're a follower of that religion. It's because you've been brought up in that environment. I had a classic case with Professor Robert Eisenman, who's obviously a great theologian. He knows the text better than anyone else, and he wrote these two enormous books on the New Testament. James, the brother of Jesus, and another one, I can't remember what it is, the New Testament Code or something. Anyway, you've got two books here with about 2,000 pages between the two. And one of the main subjects he tackles is the subject of Mary Boethus being Mary of Bethany, i.e. she's Mary Magdalene. And she's mentioned a lot of times in the Talmud. And so he in about 500 pages he proved that Mary Boethus was Mary Magdalene. And so I wrote an email congratulating him and saying, marvelous, an absolute tour de force, you've proved your case. And he said, no, not at all. It's just that they based the story of Mary Magdalene upon this woman, but they're not the same at all. Which I found astounding, because the whole of his 500 pages were proving that they were the same person. And of course, why can he not accept that they are the same person? Why can he not make that final jump and say they are the same person? Well, because if he said that, then Mary Magdalene would have had to have been active and doing the things she was doing in the AD 60s, not the AD 30s. So even someone like Eisenman, who's Jewish, of course, he's not Christian, cannot make that leap from what we've all been told, the standard Christian creed, and what actually happened. So you have to break that mold. You have to jump out of that. You have to be very dispassionate about what you're researching and just say, look, I'm just going to go with the evidence. Where's the evidence going to take me?
Is there a connection with Mary and Queen Scotia of the Scots and Cleopatra?
Well, sort of, yes, but excuse me, a very tentative link, because Scotia. Hello? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'm here. That's okay.
My computer went off, so I just presumed I'd lost you.
Okay.
Yes, it's a very tentative link, because Scotia is like about 1300 BC, and obviously Mary Magdalene is turn of the first century. So we've got 1350, 1400 years difference between the two women. Are they related? Yes, they probably are related, because I trace Scotia. For listeners who don't know where we've jumped at present, we've jumped into the Amarna era of Pharaoh Akhenaten, and there is an old story about a queen of Egypt being exiled to Scotland, and her name was Queen Scotia, of course. And it's supposed to be from Scotia and Gaithalos that the Scottish and the Gaelic people were named, etc. So this is a very old story that comes back from Irish and Scottish history. It's a very old story indeed, actually. It comes from about the 6th century.
So that Scotland would have been named after her?
Well, that's what the texts say. So this comes from the Lebor Gabála, which is an Irish text, and the Scottish Chronicon, which is a sort of 14th century Scottish text. And in the latter of these, Scottish Chronicon, they were trying to chronicle the history of Scotland, trying to prove its antiquity. And so they relied on these Irish texts, the Labor Gabala, and essentially, yes, it said that the Scottish people were named after Queen Scota, and she came from Egypt. Of course, she was an Egyptian queen.
Was she a Greco-Egyptian queen or just Egyptian?
No, this is a long time before Greece.
Okay.
This is 1300 BC. So the interesting thing, I've done a whole book on this. This is called Scota, Queen of the Scots. It's a very fragmentary history, of course. We're going back more into legend than history. But legends, I always believe, are normally based upon history. People don't just simply make up fiction all the time. They like to base their mythology on something. And it just so happened that the history they were writing actually conforms to what we know of modern Egyptian history. So the era they were talking about was the Amarna period, the period of Pharaoh Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And it's saying things about this era that really a lot of it was not actually known until the modern era. And a lot of the information they were using was actually from Manetho. But it was a different version of Manetho to the one we have. Manetho being an Egyptian historian from about the 3rd century BC. So they were using quite good historical data in order to make up this mythology, this history of Scotland. And a lot of it conforms to what we now know of the Amarna era. So in tracing that through and looking at the names, because it gives different names to these people, to the standard history from Manetho and so on, but they match up with what we know. And comparing these names with history as we know it, it looks like Gaithalos, the prince or the king, was actually Pharaoh I, who was a courtier in the administration of Amarna, who became Pharaoh after Tutankhamun died. And in fact, in going through the genealogies, I end up saying that I was actually the father of Tutankhamun, because we don't know who the father of Tutankhamun was exactly. So it looks like I was the father of Tutankhamun, and his wife was Ankhesenamun, or Ankhesenamun Ba'aten. So
Queen Scota might be the mother of the Scots and possibly the English people.
Yes, yes. So these two characters, who I trace back to Pharaoh I and Queen Ankhesenamun, were pushed out of Egypt. Now this is funny because it says in Scotti Chronicon that the Egyptian king and queen were exiled from Egypt. Now this never happens. Egypt was the strongest, the most powerful, the most stable of nations in the world. So why is someone going to make up this stupid claim, this incredulous claim, that a king and queen were thrown out of Egypt? It just doesn't happen. And as far as history as it would have been known when these texts were written, it would have not been known that that ever happened. But it just so happens that what they're doing is looking back to this particular period, the Amarna period. And in that era, and in that era alone, is the only time pretty much in Egyptian history when we know that a king and a queen could well have been exiled from Egypt. And there were two. There was Akhenaten and Nefertiti, who we don't know where they went to. It's said that they died in Egypt, but there is no evidence for their death in Egypt. So they may well have been exiled. And then the other two who disappear in strange circumstances are Pharaoh I and Ankhesenamun.
Or this could be possibly propaganda, and they were actually colonizing the world.
Well, yes, but how did the Scottish chroniclers and the Irish chroniclers know that Ay and Ankhesenamun were exiled from Egypt, when nobody knew about that until about the 19th century. So this is why I think there is a basis of history within Scotti Chronicon and the Labor Gabala, because they are understanding things that we did not understand until recently, which is why I think it might well be based on truth. So what happened, of course, is there was a change in an administration. I came in and took over the throne after Tutankhamun, but the storm clouds were brewing, and I disappears. And he's replaced by Horemheb, who's more of a traditionalist. And that is the collapse of the Amarna regime. So everything then that was to do with Amarna is destroyed. The whole city is destroyed, all of the statues, all of the artwork, everything is destroyed of the Amarna era. So what happened to Ay and Ankhesenamun? Well, if you pick up on Scotti Chronicon, that picks up the story, and it says that they were pushed out, and they went to the Balearic Islands, obviously near Spain, on the River Ebro. So they initially went to the River Ebro, and that's why the Ebro is called the Ebro, because it was named after one of the sons of this queen. And that's why Spain is called Iberia, because it was named after one of the sons, of course, who was called Heba. And then some generations later, I'm thinking about 300 years later or so, they then made the journey around to Ireland and Scotland. And that is why Scotland has the same name as Spain, because they were named after the same son. So Spain is called Iberia, and Scotland is called Hibernia, because that's where this family went to. So
they would have went with, of course, a lot of people.
Yeah,
possibly.
They would have taken, I estimate they must have had at least sort of 50 ships or something. Otherwise, you could not set up, there's a bare minimum you need to set up a new colony somewhere. And I'm reckoning on something like up to 50 ships, 1,000 people or something like that, if you want to be successful in setting up a new colony. Maybe a bit less, but you need a certain amount of wealth and all the various tradesmen you need to keep a civilization going. And if you look at the various monuments that were built around there, they sort of indicate that this journey did take place. So there are boat tombs on the Balearic Islands, which are identical to boat tombs that were built on the west coast of Ireland. And they not only look the same, they're exactly the same size as well. They got the same dimensions. So it was an interesting story. I mean, unfortunately, when you're looking back that far, looking back 3,300 years, it's very difficult to prove whether something actually happened. And of course, for a new colony like these exiles coming from Egypt, it's very difficult for them to leave a trace of their life and times and the events, because they would have been, fairly impoverished in comparison with Egypt. So there's no great carvings, there's no great literature or anything that's come out of this region to actually say what happened.
And that could have been destroyed possibly by a competing tribe or someone else at a later time.
They might not have even built very much, because it's very difficult, once you come away from your power base, if you don't have the artisans, if you don't have the bronze workers and various, all the things, the tool makers you need, it's very difficult to make the sort of architecture that you were getting in Egypt when you're struggling to make a living in the Balearic Islands or in Ireland when they finally went to Ireland. It's very difficult. I mean, there are monuments there that go back that era, but they're fairly simple, boat tombs. They're just piling Well, they're corbelled, so they're not that primitive. You know, a corbelled boat tomb. It's like an upturned boat. If you can imagine, if you just flip a boat upside down, chop it in half, so you've got a door at the front, as it were. That's what they look like. And of course, a boat tomb is sort of exactly what we might expect from an exiled population who have been pushed out of Egypt. The sort of, in fact, I'm not entirely sure they're tombs. They might have even been sort of like small chapels or something. But yes, making a tomb in the fashion of a boat would be something you're going to do, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and you see later the Chaldees as well. I'm not sure if you've done much research into them, but they also built similar buildings like that, like little beehive type of buildings, dome buildings out of the rocks.
In Ireland, yes, there's lots of beehive buildings. But I was looking for buildings that are similar on the exile route, so similarities between Spain and Ireland.
Okay.
And there are quite a number of similarities. They all built round towers as well, round towers that go back, to the Bronze Age. And they built the same round towers in the Balearics as they did in Ireland. So there are quite a few links that indicate that this history might be a true history.
And they would have possibly went to Italy as well?
Well, yes, because it's a subject that I need to look into more, and I've just not really had the time to do it. But we had a very strange event back in the sort of 12th century BC, which is known as the Sea People invasion. And for no apparent reason, all of the islands of the Mediterranean got together in a vast confederation and attacked Egypt, and very nearly defeated Egypt too. And you've got to ask yourself, why would all of these, relatively impoverished, they weren't exactly at the forefront of the economy for this sort of era, why would all the islands of the Mediterranean gang up on Egypt? Well, there is one good reason that would explain all of this stuff, and that is if all of these islands, from Sardinia, the Balearics, Crete, Cyprus, all of these islands, and Sicily too, had been populated by exiles from Egypt. So if these exiles who had been pushed out during the Akhenaten Exodus, during the I Exodus, maybe even before that, during the original Exodus, the Exodus of the Hyksos out of Egypt, if they had been pushed out and they had populated all these islands a couple of 100 years before, they might well have wanted to take revenge upon Egypt and attack Egypt. So it would explain that the Sea People invasion, which happened in about sort of the 12th century BC.
That would have been in the Ramses period?
Yeah, it was Ramses the Third, isn't it, who wrote up the big saga of the Sea People invasion. It's on the tomb at Medinet Habu, down in Thebes, and all of the walls are covered in these big battle scenes between the Sea People who were invading at the time of Ramesses III. And as I said, they nearly actually conquered the whole of Egypt, so it was quite a major invasion.
And there's no real name. They were just a confederacy as far as
no. There were many names. I mean, the names were the Shadanu, who are the Sardinians. They still have the same name, and the main ones were the Danoi, of course, the Dans, and the Danoi are the Greeks, because the Greeks are called the Danoi. So yeah, there were many names that indicate to us which islands all of these people came from. That's why we know, which islands they came from. So the Greeks were the Danoi, as were the Trojans, of course. They were the One was the Danoi, and the other one was the Danoios. Anyway, they had very similar names, whatever they were.
That'd be the tribe of Dan, of course.
Well, yes, I mean, that's obviously what some people say. I'm not entirely sure if that's exactly so, but it is a possibility, yes.
Yeah, because basically there's still a game going on behind the scenes with the world powers, and a lot of this stuff's kind of concealed. It's coming out now, of course, with great researchers, alternative researchers such as yourself, but it's been a hidden game, and it seems like we're kind of in the apocalypse, which is the unveiling now, and
Yes,
people like yourself.
Well, yeah, it's been covered up, but this is not a New World Order cover-up. This is a Catholic cover-up. You know, this has been covered up for 2,000 years. It's quite obvious from reading Josephus Flavius that he knew a great deal more than he was actually saying. And he points in this direction on many occasions, and people just ignore him. They say, oh, he's mistaken. So when he says major things like the Israelites, the Jews, were the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt, everyone just says, yeah, he was just mistaken, you know. But no.
And that, of course, would be the established scholars who are, of course, from the universities that are backed mainly by the Catholic Church.
Yes, but I mean, this has been covered up for 2,000 years. It's not a recent cover-up. You know, obviously, yeah, people are still maintaining the status quo, because once you go to a university, you have to maintain the status quo, because if you go too far off to one side, you might fall off. So people try to stay within the established history, and the established history and theology says that the Jews were entirely separate from Egypt, apart from the fact they spent 400 years in Egypt and things like that. You know, but they're not the same people at all. But people like Strabo said the Jews were Egyptians, and Josephus said the Jews were Egyptians, and everyone says, oh no, they're not. But they were, of course. They were the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt.
Which the Hyksos would be a hybrid bloodline.
Shepherd kings. Well, we don't know exactly who the Hyksos were. The standard story is that the Hyksos were a Semitic tribe who came down from Mesopotamia up that sort of way somewhere, and drifted down into Egypt and took over the Nile Delta region. This is like 1750 BC, something like that, 1700 BC. I'm not entirely sure that that's true, because I think the dispute, because there was a dispute between these two peoples, and it ended up as a civil war. And from that civil war, the Hyksos were then kicked out of Egypt. And because they had this big civil war, there is an assumption that they were a different people. But I don't think they were a different people. I think the Hyksos were actually Egyptians, and they've been in Egypt, you know, since the dawn of time. And the difference between them, the reason they had this civil war, was nothing to do with them being separate tribes and separate people. It was because the heavens had changed in the skies above, and so their religion had changed. And it was this difference in religion that caused the tensions, and it caused the civil war and the Exodus.
So this might have been the forming of Israel and the Jews, this new religion.
Yes, well, no, it wasn't a new religion. It was the old religion. The problem was that the Thebans didn't update their calendars. So most of these old religions, or this particular one anyway, was based on astrology. So they were looking to the stars and the heavens. That's what all these religions are about. You know, all of these characters are stellar characters. You know, whether it's Ra or Thoth or Isis, they're all characters in the solar system or in the heavens above. And one of the main things they were looking at was the precession of the equinox. So they were counting off the great months of the great year. Will your listeners be familiar with precession?
I believe some will, definitely.
Well, just as a very, very quick explanation, the Earth wobbles on its axis, and in doing so, it manages to spin through all of the constellations every 25,400 years, or whatever it is. So if you look due east on the vernal equinox, the spring equinox, at 6 o'clock in the morning, the constellation you see rising at the spring equinox changes. And it changes every 2,200 years roughly from one constellation to the next constellation, which is very useful because if you want to make a note of a particular date, or if you want to make a date in the future, you just say, okay, age of Aquarius, third day in the age of Aquarius, and you can mark your date to about the nearest 10 or 20 years. So if you say a king was born in the month of Taurus, the processional month of Taurus, you know he was born, between 4,400 BC and 1800 BC. So you can mark off whatever date you like within history just by knowing the constellation that people were born under, which is brilliant. But I'm not talking, of course, about the constellation you're born under from your trashy magazine or newspaper.
Your birth chart, right?
Yeah, that's a monthly one. That's an annual one. I'm not talking about an annual constellation, an annual zodiac. We're talking about the great year, which lasts 26,000 years roughly. And so all of these constellations move through that 26,000 years. And you can mark off dates, obviously, within that period. So just to give you an idea, the age of Taurus started, I'm just guessing here because I can't remember, it's about 4,500 BC. And Taurus was quite a long constellation, so it wasn't 2,200 years, it was a bit longer. And
so, for example, we're in 2013 right now, would be 2013 years into this age,
yes.
Which is, okay.
Yes,
gotcha.
Because we reset our date not on the birth of Jesus, we reset our date on the start of the great month of Pisces. That's why we zeroed the date at that time, because in year 0 we went from Aries to Pisces. So it's all to do with astrology, and this is what this religion was following. That's why at that point, 2,000 years ago, they were looking for a special Messiah, a special king, because that was the start of the new great month of Pisces, which started 2,000 years ago. And they found their special Messiah king, and his name was Jesus, of course. And that's why he was born as a Lamb of God. He was born in Aries, but became a fisher of men, because the constellation changed to Pisces in about AD 10, roughly. So he was the first king of Pisces, the first of the fisher kings, which is why we have the fisher kings within Arthurian legend. That's why the Pope wears the fisher ring. That's why the symbol of Christianity is the fish.
Can you tell us about Jesus and Edessa and where he had come from, his kingdom, and so forth?
Yeah.
Without revealing too much, of course, I want readers, our listeners, to go check out your book.
Well, they would have to check out the book anyway, because this is very complex. It's not something you can just talk about and you can instantly understand. It's quite a complex little, that's why it took so long for me to actually find it. It's taken me 20 years more to get this far. In all, it's taken me 40 years to get this far. Because it's been superbly covered up. So we have this character who was this special fisher king, the new king of the new great month of Pisces. And he's been deleted from the historical record, or rather the biblical record that we are relying upon. And you have to ask yourself why. You have all of these famous characters, say Jesus and Saul, who is probably as famous as Jesus himself. And they're all missing from the historical record, which is not possible. You've either got two solutions here. Either all of this is fiction and they didn't exist, or someone has covered up who they are. Because if you just read the New Testament, it's like this story didn't even happen on this planet. You know, maybe it happened on Mars or something.
And Rome, of course, would be in control of the New Testament.
Of course. And the person who wrote the New Testament was Saul Josephus, our wonderful character called Josephus. And this is the beauty of this idea that Saul is Josephus, because if he was, and there's a lot of evidence to say he was, then after the Great Revolt in AD 70, Judea and Jerusalem were destroyed. And the only person left standing was Saul Josephus, who became effectively the de facto king, as it were, of Judea, because there was no one else left there. There was the Romans.
He'd be the last of that bloodline and the legitimate successor.
In a way, because, yes, I haven't managed to attach him onto that line precisely yet, but I think, yes, he was a part of that royal line. In fact, I think he was the brother of John the Baptist, because they have the same names, family names. But anyway, he was a part of that family somewhere, and he was the only man left standing. But
and I'll give you a little tip, Ralph. I researched this area a little bit. The Hasmoneans and the Maccabees.
Yes,
That's
yes.
the two.
So you know
the two families. Yeah, the two families that I see a connection to.
Yes.
Josephus and St. John. So.
But that might be true. But if that is true, if John the Baptist and Josephus were on the Hasmonean line, then they are completely separate to the Jesus line, because the Jesus line comes from Persia.
Okay.
Well, from Persia and Egypt. So maybe, yes, they may have been two competing royal lines. I was tending to think they were, you know, subsets of the same royal line, you know, cousins or whatever down the line.
Yeah, no, and again, it's just I saw a connection there. I'm not in I just saw one, and I wanted to let you know, just to look into that. Okay.
So where did this family come from? So they must have come from somewhere. He was called a king. It's pretty obvious from all of the New Testament and from the works of Eisenman that these were important people. It was obvious from things like the Golden Legend, who says that Mary Magdalene was a princess and she owned a castle. It's obvious from the Talmud, who says that Mary Bothus, who is Mary Magdalene, of course, was the richest woman in Judea. She was the first millionaire. She had 1 million sesterces. She was so rich that she bought the high priesthood for Jesus. That's how Jesus became the high priest of Jerusalem, as it says in Hebrews 7. She bought the high priesthood with a takub of silver, it says, which is something like 100 kilos of silver. An enormous amount of money. I mean, that's how rich they were. So who is this family? There is a very long and complex story that took 3 books of mine to actually find out exactly where they came from. The first book, Cleopatra to Christ, says that they came out of Persia. Why out of Persia? Because why would the Magi be interested in the birth of Jesus? The Magi were the Persian priesthood and the Persian kingmakers. What were they doing at Jesus' birth? So what we're looking for in the sort of birth of Jesus is a prince who was on the move for some reason, in a state of some poverty, who this was obviously in about AD 4, and who was linked to Persia because of the Persian Magi coming to his birth. And there were various other points about his birth. And can you match this up with the historical record? Well, yes, we can. Because in about AD 4, the Prince of Parthia, Persia, was exiled from Persia. This is Queen Theomusa Orania and her husband, son, Phraatesses. And they were exiled from Persia in about AD 4 They were on the move, looking for somewhere to live in about 84, and if they had had a son at that point, then yes, of course, the Persian Magi would have been very interested in this particular prince, because he would have been a potential prince of Parthia. And of course, it would, this sort of explains why the Herod story about trying to kill all the infants and so on, a king like Herod doesn't go around killing infants because a carpenter has had a child. Yeah, the only reason for this rumor to spread around was because this was a prince of some influence, a prince who was a competitor for Herod himself. So this was the initial thought, that Jesus came from Persia. But why did he come from Persia? He wasn't Persian, actually. He was Egyptian, because this queen, this Persian queen, was not actually Persian. She was half Egyptian. She was related to Cleopatra the Seventh. So what we have here is a bloodline that was half Ptolemaic Egyptian. Well, it can't be half. Let's say a third. a third Ptolemaic Egyptian through Cleopatra, a third Roman through Julius Caesar, and a third Persian through Phraates IV, because she married Phraates IV.
So that essentially, what you're saying is that Egypt, Rome, and Persia were all working together at that time.
Well, this was why he was a threat. He was a threat to everybody, not just Herod, because he was a prince of Rome, of Egypt, and Persia. There was no better connected monarch in the entire world. If he had found a throne to sit on, he could have been the king of the entire known world. This was the threat to Rome. This is why Rome got involved in this dispute. And the dispute actually happened in AD 68. This was the Jewish civil revolt, of course. This wasn't the comparative calm of AD 30. This was the Jewish revolt and the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Because he made a bid not just for Judea, the throne of Judea. He made a bid for the throne of Rome. Because the throne of Rome was empty at that time. Nero had just died, committed suicide, whatever. And the throne of Rome was empty for whoever could throw their hat into the ring. And 4 people did. I can't remember all their names now, but anyway, there was 2 pretenders to the throne of Rome who were both dispatched within a few months. And then there was Vespasian, and then there was the other prince who disappeared off the radar because the Vespasians didn't want you to know there was someone else involved in this bid for the throne of Rome. And that person was the person that Vespasian was fighting in Judea, and his name was Jesus, as it would be, Jesus of Gamala. This was the famous Jesus of Gamala we were talking about that Josephus speaks about so much in his books. He was the guy who created the Jewish revolt. He is the one who was defeated in AD 70 by Vespasian. And it was Vespasian who went on to become emperor, of course. And Vespasian only did this because he took the star prophecy, which was the great prophecy in the East, which said the new king of the world, actually, not just the king of Rome, but the new king of the world would be a star from the East. But who was born under the Eastern Star? That was Jesus, of course. That's why we have this story about the star at his birth. So the star prophecy belonged to Jesus. But it was Vespasian, Commander Vespasian, who used this star prophecy to become emperor of Rome. So
he was more like a pretender.
Well, of course, he was a commoner. He wasn't royal at all. He had no royal blood whatsoever. But if he could use the star prophecy of Jesus to become emperor, then what were the designs and strategies and goals of Jesus himself? He wanted to become emperor. That was the whole point. But in his bid to become emperor of Rome, he needed to take over the Roman East. He needed to take over Judea, Syria, Jordan, all of the Roman East, which was a very powerful part of the Roman Empire at that stage. You wouldn't believe it now if you go there. I mean, it's as poor as you can possibly get. But in the Roman era, it was probably the richest part of the Roman Empire, was the Roman East. And so if you could take the Roman East, then you were in a very powerful position to take over the whole of the empire. So this was the story of the biblical Jesus. And this is how far we got within, say, Cleopatra to Christ and King Jesus, the first two books in the trilogy, which was great. We had identified who the biblical Jesus was and what his goals and the strategies were. He was Jesus of Gamala, and he was also linked with these princes that had come from Persia, and his name was called Esus. And of course it turned out, of course, looking into these things, that Jesus and Esus were the same person. So we ended up with this prince who had started the Jewish revolt, and we know they were the same person, Jesus and Esus, because Josephus Flavius says that there were two people who started the Jewish revolt. Well, actually, he doesn't say that. He has two separate accounts, basically, of the start of the Jewish revolt. One is led by Jesus of Gamala, and the other one is led by Prince Esus. So it's pretty obvious that they're the same person. So we made this great identification, but the trouble is that identification doesn't really tell us very much, because we don't know who Jesus of Gamala was, and we don't know who Esus was either.
So we just have these vague references.
Yeah, we have, and like Josephus is the only guy who talks about these people. So we don't. There's no archaeology. I mean, how can you have a history without archaeology? They're just sort of nebulous names that appear in his works, and everyone presumes they are real people because Josephus tends to be reliable in a very unreliable way, as it were. He's predictably unreliable, put it that way.
So Josephus would have been, of course, Jewish, and he teamed up with Rome.
Yeah, so he was writing for the Romans. So everything has a Roman bias on the top of it.
Okay.
And that's why he's reliably unreliable. You know his perspective, so you know what to expect from him. If it conflicts with what Rome wanted, then you know he's going to cover it up. And you always know he's covering up things because he'll say, a certain person did this. Yeah, a certain person. Come on, Josephus. Josephus knew everything that was happening in the first century. And the only reason he writes a certain person or a certain place is because he doesn't want you to know who they are.
To conceal it.
Absolutely. He does this all the time.
And of course, your connections that you'll be looking for are probably in the Vatican archives, I assume.
Well, I do wonder what they have, but you don't need the Vatican archives to actually find the real information. The information is out there, as they say. They couldn't cover up everything. And Josephus didn't want to cover up everything. Josephus was the biggest egotist the world has ever seen, bar none. And he was so clever that he wanted everyone to know he was so clever, because everyone hated him as well, which is another reason for wanting everyone to know how clever you are. So he left all these little clues all the way through it. He wasn't that stupid. These clues are not left by mistake. They're left deliberately because he wanted you to know how clever he was. I can't believe he was doing it out of altruism or anything of that nature. He wasn't doing it to leave the truth for mankind. I don't think he was that sort of person. He was doing it because he was darn clever, and he wanted you to know he was darn clever. So if you look at Josephus, you can actually work out what he's talking about. And the big cover-up that he made, it's a cover-up that goes on today. There's a huge, great debate going on in academia at present because everyone said my theory was rubbish, and then they found out that they didn't know what they were actually talking about, which is great actually to read. There's one on a blog about a guy called McClellan, and another one. What's the other one? I'll remember who he is soon. But anyway, if you look up on
your big critics, right?
Yeah, big critics. But I don't like these sort of critics because they sneeringly sort of condemn you and say this is impossible. But then they don't realize that you actually know a great deal more than they do about this subject. I've been reading this subject for 40 years now. Give me some credit. I know a little bit about it. And then they start floundering because they suddenly find out that they don't actually know anything about this subject. And then they get angry and write all sorts of rubbish. And then they just delete all of their threads because they get so embarrassed that they've lost the argument that they just delete everything. So,
that's what's terrible about the internet.
Yeah. So we have all of these deleted blogs all over the internet where these academics have lost the story, basically. They've lost the argument. And the argument was about something that is pretty academic. You wouldn't think that this is, the cornerstone of theology is where is Adya Beni? And your listeners might think, Adya who? Why is this important? Well, it's important because this king we were talking about, King Isis, who I have identified with King Jesus, of course, came from Adya Beni. But nobody knows where Adya Beni is. Or rather, academics say they know where Adya Beni is. But they don't actually know where Adya Beni is because all of the information that they're relying on has all been, I wouldn't say made up, but it's been influenced by our friend Josephus. And Josephus, he doesn't commit himself. For Josephus, he won't tell a lie. He will lead you around the houses and he will put you off the scent. But he doesn't seem to want to tell a direct lie, so he won't say that Adya Beni is there. He just leaves you guessing. And the academics looking at the Roman records have deduced that it's in Iraq. It's over by Mosul. It's a place called Arbela. But it's not, because if you read all of these Roman accounts, if you read what Josephus was saying about it, it's pretty obvious that it wasn't in Iraq. It was actually Edessa. And again, your listeners will say, Edessa who? What? Why don't we know about Edessa? Edessa was the first city to be converted to Christianity. It was the most influential city as far as the Gospels were concerned outside Jerusalem. Why don't we know about it? Well, it's been deleted from history, and for a very specific reason. The main reason is because Josephus has deleted it. So we have a famous city and a famous king. We have the city of Edessa and King Agbarus Okama. And again, your listeners will say, who? What? He's one of the most famous kings from the 1st century AD. Why haven't you heard about him? Because Josephus Flavius has deleted him from history. So Josephus, I don't know if you've seen the books of Josephus. It's quite a fat tome, his books. And it's probably about 2,000 pages or something. And he writes the whole history of the 1st century Near East. But he never once mentions Edessa, and he never once mentions King Akbarus. Why? Because he didn't want you to know who they were. What he does is he's renamed them, and he's renamed them as Adyabeni and King Monobazas. So everyone is off looking for King Monobazas down in Iraq somewhere, and he's not there. Doesn't
Yeah,
exist.
that's when they say the pen is mightier than the sword. This
Absolutely.
would be a perfect example.
Yeah, because why doesn't he mention these famous people? Well, because he didn't want you to know that they're in northern Syria, and they're actually called Edessa and King Akbarus. And King Akbarus actually appears in the New Testament. He's in the Acts of the Apostles, but they call him Agabus instead.
And what's interesting is we have the Syria conflicts right now, so it's kind of interesting that we're here in 2000.
Yes, it's actually in it's in Turkey now. Actually, I mean, it used to be Syria, but it's been taken over by the Turks. But yeah, that's a real problem. I mean, you can't get to places like Palmyra, which is one of my famous sites, and Apamea, and I'm just hoping that places like Palmyra don't get trashed, because the trouble is they'll be in there looting the museums and everything will disappear, and God knows what will happen. So I hope these places don't get trashed, because Syria has some of the best antiquities anywhere in the Roman world. Because as I said before, it used to be a very, very rich place. So yes, we have this lost and forgotten king, King Akbarus, king of Edessa. He appears in the New Testament. He is closely connected with the New Testament. This is the king who, according to subsequent records from Eusebius and from various other people, was writing letters to Jesus. So that we've got this big long story about the letters that he wrote to Jesus and the replies that he got back. So he was very closely connected with the New Testament story. And that's another indication that this actually happened in the AD 60s, because these letters, if you read the text properly, were actually written in the AD 50s, most of them, late AD 40s and AD 50s. And Jesus was making replies in the AD 40s and 50s, which is very interesting from the standard perspective. So we have this king, and it just so happens, of course, because in the previous books I'd identified the biblical Jesus with King Esus, who was the king of Adyabeni. But now, with this further research, it suddenly became apparent that Adyabeni was actually Edessa. And the Syriac, when I went to Syria and eastern Turkey, the Syriac historians say that the queen of Adyabeni married King Akbarus. So she was the queen of Edessa. And it transpires, it's difficult to explain exactly why, but the prince of Edessa was therefore this King Esus that we've been talking about. And King Esus was King Jesus, the biblical Jesus. So having gone through this big, long, tortuous research project, we end up with Jesus being a king of Edessa. And his name was, according to Josephus, his name was Esus. According to the historical record, because he's a real historical character, his name was Manu. And
from my understanding, Ralph, I know that the letter J wasn't used back then, and it was recently, I think about 500 years ago, it was incorporated into our language, and I think that's might be where we get Jesus today.
Yes, because, well, I mean, in the Greek, he was called Esus, of course. So Jesus has, obviously his name has been transliterated into the various languages. So his original name, forget the Judaic one. They say it was derived from Joshua, which I don't believe at all. So his name in the Greek was Isus, and his name in the Persian is Isa. Is what he's called in the Quran. He's called Isa. And this equates very well with this name of this prince who's called Isus. And that's why, one of many reasons why they're the same person. But I think one of the best reasons is, this prince of Edessa was the guy who started the Jewish revolt. So he was a revolutionary who started the Jewish revolt in Judea and was in Jerusalem when Jerusalem fell to the Romans in AD 70. And, of course, Jerusalem fell to Vespasian, who became the next emperor of Rome, of course.
And they would have executed Jesus.
No, they crucified him.
Crucified him, correct.
Yeah, well, he wasn't... the reason why I say he wasn't executed is because he didn't die. And this is where we get the gospel story. So in Josephus, his history of the Jewish revolt, he says that the three leaders of the Jewish revolt, who included this King Isus, this king of Edessa, were crucified after the Jewish revolt. But Josephus came back along the Kidron Valley and saw them being crucified. And he went to the governor and asked for them to be taken down from the cross. And the governor agreed. So he had them taken down from the cross. 2 of them died, and 1 of them survived. Familiar story?
Definitely.
Better still than that, the person who took them down from the cross was called Josephus. Josephus of Arimathea. And the kings of Edessa, he would have been dressed as a king of Edessa, this rebel leader called Isus, King Isus. He would have been dressed as a king of Edessa. And the kings of Edessa always wore a ceremonial crown of thorns. It fits like a glove. This is the real history. This is the New Testament story. It was a story of a real revolution, not just a theological revolution. This was a revolution of King Isus trying to get back his heritage because he was a king of Egypt and Rome and Persia. He wanted to sit upon the throne of Rome. And he started the Jewish revolt to that end. But Rome opposed him, of course. They weren't going to give up that easily. And the man who opposed them was Commander Vespasian. And Commander Vespasian won that particular revolt, that battle. Jesus was executed with his crown of thorns. And the man who crucified him and defeated him went on to become Emperor of Rome. So Jesus really lost in that case. The man who defeated him, who was only a commander, took the position that he wanted. But, of course, he did end up on the throne of Rome. But in name only. He became the primary icon of the Catholic Church, which became the new emperors of Rome, of course. The new popes of Rome became the new emperors of Rome after Rome was dissolved, of course, after the Western...
Almost like the sacrificial lamb, the martyr.
Yeah, so he became emperor, but in name only. So it was a bit of a defeat. But he did go on to influence the whole of Western culture and influence Western culture in many different respects. So we have the Catholic Church, of course, which was based upon his history. Okay, it was a It was a bastardized history of the Edessan kings. No, that's probably the wrong way to put it. It was the revolt of the Edessan kings with fairy dust applied to it. So if you read the New Testament, you wouldn't initially think that this was, a real secular battle for the east of the Roman Empire. So it was the Jewish revolt with fairy dust.
And of course, this would be their main gripe with the New Testament and not recognizing it.
Yes, sorry, say that again. Who wouldn't recognize it?
Well, at first the Jews, it was always the Jews against the Christians, as far as you had the Old Testament and then the creation of the New Testament with the Romans and the Roman religion.
Yes. Now, the Jews knew exactly what was going on. If you read the Talmud, they knew exactly who these people were. But they couldn't say anything about it because they would have been strung up, of course. This church became all-powerful fairly early on, even after the Jewish revolt. It's my argument that this new religion was actually backed by Rome. It wasn't persecuted by Rome. The religion that they were persecuting was the old religion, which was the religion of Jesus, the Nazarene religion, the fourth sect of Judaism. That was the religion that was being persecuted. The new religion that was created by Saul, Josephus, which I call simple Judaism, the Nazarene Judaism with fairy dust applied on top of it. Mm-hmm. Now that was being backed by Rome because it was saying exactly what Rome wanted. It was
almost like the true teachings were kind of hidden behind allegories and different names.
It was just pure propaganda. There was nothing, as far as the Roman emperors were concerned, there was nothing special about Christianity. It was just a simple propaganda ploy. The east of the Roman Empire was always revolting, and what they wanted was stability in the Eastern Roman Empire. Judaism and all the various forms of Judaism did not make very good Romans. They wouldn't eat with Romans, they wouldn't bathe with Romans, they wouldn't pray with Romans, they wouldn't honor the Roman emperors as gods. They were just not very good Romans, and they were always causing hassle on the eastern borders. What Rome wanted was a Rome-friendly form of Judaism, a Judaism for Gentiles, a Judaism for Romans, a Judaism that would eat with Romans, would bathe with Romans, would pray alongside other Romans. And that's exactly what they got. And they got it because it was created by Saul Josephus, who was working for the Romans. So he wrote this new, what I call simple Judaism, Judaism light, which was Judaism for Gentiles.
And that's why they accept Gentiles, of course. It's the Catholic Church.
Of course, that's why all of us.
But in reality, it was a Jewish religion, just kind of with a new fairy dust on it, where Gentiles were allowed, and the sacrifices were ended, and the blood turned to wine.
But the important thing was that it was Rome-friendly. So, and it spread a message of peace. Judaism was not being a very peaceful religion, basically. But this new simple Judaism was all about turning the other cheek. It was nothing about war. So this is why all the war bits of the Jewish revolt were deleted. I mean, there are still one or two there. There's the little apocalypse, as it is called, within the New Testament, which says that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed and not one stone will be left upon another, and fathers will fight against their sons and daughters against their mothers and all this sort of business, which is all what Jesus says. What does he say? He says it here. See you these great buildings, there shall not be one stone left upon another that shall not be thrown down. And you will hear rumors of wars. Be not troubled, as such things need be. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and troubles and the beginnings of sorrows. brother will betray the brother to death, and the father the son, and the children shall rise up against their parents and cause them to be put to death. It's a good description of a civil war, basically, isn't it? Families fighting amongst each other. That is a description of the Jewish revolt. But you wouldn't get that impression if you initially just scanned the New Testament, because it's become a very, very small portion of the New Testament, but it's there nonetheless.
It was almost like they had the wars and they were attempting to domesticate mankind, because we were warring. We were priest warrior kings, and everybody was...
Well, I don't know about... it was domesticating the east of the Roman Empire. I'm not sure if it was about mankind. This
Gotcha.
was Roman propaganda, pure and simple. They wanted peace on the eastern borders of the Roman Empire, and this was the way they were going to get it. And the man they chose to do it was Saul Josephus, because he was a Jew who had fought for the Romans. He had become Romanized, and he knew everything there was in first century Judea on the eastern side of the Roman Empire. You know, he wrote the Jewish War, he wrote Antiquities, he wrote his life, and he wrote most of the New Testament. And so he was in a perfect position, as far as the Romans were concerned, to set up this propaganda. And that's exactly what he did. And that's where we get this new story from.
Do you think they'll ever release it, the Catholic religion, the Vatican?
It's going to be very hard for them to fight against this particular identification that I've made. This is the trouble. They're going to have the same trouble that the academics I've been talking to with. They will say, oh no, this is rubbish, absolute rubbish. It's got nothing to do with it. And we can show it's rubbish because of A, B, and C. And then I will just turn around and say, well, A is false, B is false, C you're completely mistaken. And here are the texts that show you are completely mistaken. And then they'll say, yeah, okay, well, try D, E, and F then. And I'll say, well, D's wrong, have a look at this text. F is wrong, have a look at that one. And so it becomes very difficult for them, everything they say, because what they're using is a standard creed, which they think they know. But they don't know it because it's been made up. It's been made up 2,000 years ago. And so when you're dealing with a made-up story, the truth always shines through underneath, because it's very difficult to create an entire history of mankind that distorts everything. There's always little bits left, little holes in the story, where the truth will shine through. And that's exactly what happens, which is why it gets very difficult, and they get very frustrated with it, that they cannot prove what you're saying is wrong. And I, conversely, can prove what I'm saying is correct. So it becomes very difficult for them. And they've had this trouble in the past, of course. They tried to make some shock troops within the Catholic Church, and most of them left the Church, because if you dig too deeply into these texts, you suddenly start finding all of these holes. So the only thing they can do is pretend that it doesn't exist. Ignore it. That's all they'll do.
What do you think, Ralph, before you would be considered a heretic and be burned at the stake, be executed, and now here we are in 2013, you and I could be here in California in the United States, you in UK, talking about Jesus and coming from Odessa, and what's going on? Why are they allowing this when before they wouldn't?
Because they've lost their power. This is the whole point of the Reformation. I write about this in my other major book, which is called Mary Magdalene, and which details her trip to France, where she stayed the rest of her life. Because it seems from that book that there have been opposition groups through the ages who have opposed this suffocation of the Catholic Church. And those groups were founded in the south of France, where Mary Magdalene is supposed to have gone to. And of course, if you look at Mary Magdalene, she is the Golden Lady. She's always dressed with orange cloaks, and she always has ginger hair. She is the Golden Lady. She is the Orange Lady. And it just so happens that in the south of France, they set up a new city. It wasn't actually called Orange at that stage. Anyway, later on it became called the City of Orange. And it's still there, of course, now. Of course, it's called Orange. But it became an independent principality. And it's long been a completely independent principality, independent of the Catholic Church and independent of France.
Almost like the Vatican.
Yeah, like the Vatican, like Monaco or something. It was an independent city-state, which was always independent and always quite different from the rest of France. And it became very powerful, and the princes of Orange became known as the Prince of Orange. And it was the princes of Orange who kicked the Muslims out of France in the 8th century. We're talking a long time ago here, in the 8th century. And the chansons of William are as big and as comprehensive as the Arthurian legend is. So they made these chansons, these songs of the legends of William. And so he became...
That'd be William of Orange?
William of Orange. But this is 8th century. Yeah, this is a long time ago. But those Williams of Orange then moved up to Holland, which is why we have these Williams of Orange in Holland. Why we've just had the new William of Orange, was just crowned only a month ago, if you remember. They became the princes of Holland, Netherlands, and they're still called the Princes of Orange today.
And then you have in Ulster, you have the Orange Order.
Orange Order, which is exactly the same. That came from William of Orange, because we had a Dutch king, William III, William of Orange, was a Dutch king who ruled England in the 17th century, late 17th century. And he went to Ireland, which is why we have the Orange Order in Ireland. But the main thing about this Orange family was they were the princes who started the Reformation. And the Reformation is something that is very, very poorly taught in our education system today in the West, because the Reformation made the West, and we don't even know anything about it. So, just as a quick, brief overview of the Reformation, Martin Luther, not the guy who was shot in America, of course, the Martin Luther, who was a cleric in the 15th century, nailed his thesis upon the doors of Wittenberg Church. And these openly challenged the Catholic Church. Basically, he was saying the Catholic Church is corrupt, and you shouldn't be following all of this idolatry, and you've lost your way completely, and we don't like your banning freedom of speech, etc., etc. So this sparked the revolution. So in these northern states, which is northern Germany, Holland, Denmark, down as far as Belgium, there started the Protestant Revolution, which became the Reformation. And it was a slow process at the beginning. But after Britain joined, with Henry VIII, we joined the Reformation as well, because we got excommunicated. And then Elizabeth I became a staunch supporter of the Reformation. It became a very, very powerful bloc in the north of Europe. And this sparked what turned out to be 100 Years' War. So there was a war that went on for pretty much all of the 1600s.
That would have been the Protestants and the Catholics.
Yep, absolutely. And the center of this revolution was the Princes of Orange in Holland, of course, and especially after one of their Princes of Orange became the King of England as well. And it was that Prince of Orange who defeated the Catholic Church. So it all ended up in Ireland, of all places. I mean, this is real inter-European diplomacy, as it were. It all ended
It's
up
almost
with a huge, great battle in Ireland, which is called the Battle of the Boyne.
it almost seems like the old relatives of the original, exodus of Egypt and so forth, and possibly the relatives of the king of Edessa, of Isis,
All fighting
were
against
these
each
people.
other. Yes.
Gotcha.
Because King Isis was defeated in Judea. His wife was Mary Magdalene. His wife went to the south of France. Mary Magdalene went to the south of France. Orange is in the south of France. She was the Orange Lady. The city of Orange is known for being orange. Its motif is the orange. And this is not just about fruits. We're not talking about fruits here. These oranges are symbolic of the sun, because
It almost sounds like it's connected to Akhenaten, Aten.
Well,
the sun
well,
religion.
no, it came from this family who came from Persia that I was telling you about. Her name was Orania, and orange, pronounced properly in the Dutch, is Orania. And it means not just orange, of course, because it's an orange sphere. It's Orania means the heavens, of course. It's Greek for heaven. She was the Queen of Heaven, Queen Orania. But of course, this orange ball is an image of the sun, the gold, because it means gold as well, which is why orange is orange, because it's gold. If you see what I mean. Or is means gold in Latin, of course. So
what's interesting, Ralph, just while you're talking about that, I had some research came to my head, as I remember Cleopatra, that she would be depicted in drawings with the horns and an orange globe between those horns,
because she was,
when she's depicted as Isis or
yes,
whatever.
She was depicted as Isis, but so was Queen Orania. She was the Queen of Heaven. That's what Queen Orania means. And Isis was the Queen of Heaven. So they're all incarnations of Isis. But you couldn't really depict anyone in the Renaissance period as being Isis. But you could give her a gold cloak. You could make her hair golden so that everybody knew she was the Golden Lady. She was the Princess of Orange, of Orania, of Heaven, of the Sun.
That's interesting. My family's from France as well, and they almost every single person that comes from it, not every single daughter, but woman, it's Mary is the middle name. Or
very popular.
Mary, yeah.
Yes, of course. Especially in the south of France, it's almost a cult of its own, which the Catholic Church never liked. And that's why they had the Cathar persecutions down there. So yes, this Orange Lady, we have the city of Orange in the south of France, and the first princes of Orange came from the south of France, of course. And then the princes of Orange moved up into Holland, into the Netherlands. And it was from the Netherlands that the Reformation started. And it was all based on the princes of Orange. So, there are connections after connection after connection all the way through. And but the important thing here, just to finish that story, important thing here is that Reformation, that defeat of the Catholic Church on the Battle of the Boyne in Ireland, is what made our modern world. Before that time, you could not do independent research. What we were talking about, you could not research the history of Christianity. You could not research the history of the world. You could not do science. It was just forbidden. After the Protestant Reformation, we had the Age of Reason. And suddenly you could, independence of thought and speech, you could research these topics. And because of this, and just after this, of course, we had the Industrial Revolution. So literally just after all of this happened, the Royal Society was set up in England, in London, which allowed scientific research for the first time. which sparked the Industrial Revolution, which made the Western world we have. So all of the Western, everything we see in the West today, all of our products, all of our society, all of our freedoms that we have in the Western world came from the Reformation. It came from Martin Luther nailing those theses on the doors of Wittenberg Church.
And what's interesting today, of course, we have the Catholic Church and the Jesuits. They are on board because they went into that research as well. Of course, they're not revealing stuff like you are about, the New Testament and teachings of who Jesus really was, but they're into the science now, and there might be aliens.
Yes, but that was the problem they had with the Jesuits, because they started researching the history of Christianity. They had any number of defections, because you cannot research the history of Christianity without contradicting what you've been taught in the first place and the creed you're supposed to follow. So it's very difficult for them, because the creed that they are following is based on a lie. So how can you research a lie? You always come up against one of the holes upon which your lie is based.
And then if you're a Jesuit and you say, I'm living a lie, if you research it, what's the relationship with the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church and, say, the family of Orange and Mary? Are they, recently, I think it was last year, you had Queen Elizabeth actually visit Ulster, and she visited, I think, the Catholic Church there for the first time, and you see all these different things happening. Do you think that they're teamed together now?
No. The Catholic Church is the Catholic Church. It has its own power base, and it's the sworn enemy of the Protestant Church. It's just impoverished and losing the battle because the Protestant Church opened up its people to the world of science and freedom. And of course, science and freedom produces wealth, whereas the Catholic Church and absolutism causes poverty. So that's why we won the Reformation, because the north of Europe was always richer than the south. So the Catholic Church is on a hiding to nothing. It'll never win against the Protestant Church. It can only just hold on to what it's got and try not to lose completely. But no, there is no coming together between these two churches. There never will be.
What would you say, America and UK are both Protestant countries, or are they?
America is a strange place. We have a religious constitution, and we are not religious. So I would say, just off the top of my head, 90% of the people in Britain are, as it were, atheists. By that, or you might say agnostics. By that I mean people who never go to church, know nothing really about. They'll say, oh, I'm a Christian. If you ask them, what's Christianity about, they haven't got a clue. They've never read anything beyond a Christmas card, basically. So they are de facto atheists. America is supposed to be a secular society where religion is banned in your major governmental institutions, whereas they're not in Britain. And yet it's a very religious place, and everyone believes in religion so strongly, which I find very strange. So there is not much of a meeting of minds, I don't think, at present between certainly Northern Europe and America. I suppose the only good bit about America is it's split between many different sects, so there is no one powerful sect of religion within America. They're all fighting each other too much. But no, I don't think there's any big conspiracy for the churches to get together at all.
Yeah, I've had various guests on the show, and my conclusion based on my research and the guest, I've had a 33rd degree Freemason, with George Washington being the first president and also a Freemason, and several other presidents were Freemasons, that this is a Masonic formed country.
Oh yes, I've no doubt. I'm a Mason myself. But I have to say within Masonry that they've lost a lot of their history too. Unless there is information that I'm not privy to, I don't think they don't know as much as I am. Put it this way, I teach Masonic history to Masons.
What degree are you, Ralph?
Only third. However, although I'm only third and I don't go to Grand Lodge, we had Grand Lodge past masters in our lodge. So they were actually past master from Grand Lodge in London. And they would come to me asking me questions because they didn't know the answers to these questions.
And Ralph, and I've had many discussions with several Freemasons, and then up to 32nd, and then I know 33rd they only could say so much, but I know some of these 32nd degree Masons didn't know anything. You know, it was just
Yes.
I knew a lot more than they did.
Yes, yeah, I find it surprising. So I don't know.
Okay.
You know, within a sort of secret society, you never know if someone at the top does have more information. But from what I've gleaned in my time, I don't think there are any great secrets within Masonry. I mean, it used.
And if you read Manly P. Hall, I'd say he's one of the most revealing. If you read he pretty much lays everything out on the line if you read his books.
Yes, yes. And I think they lost most of their history. But what they were trying to do is they were trying to regain it. And the only way you can regain a history is if you have a cohesive society within which you can try to regain that history and regain some of that lost knowledge. But just to give you an idea about what the knowledge was that they were trying to regain, I can give you one of the primary secrets within Masonry, which is given to you at the first degree, if I remember correctly. And this is one of the foundation secrets within Masonry. So I'll have to say it in hushed tones. And the secret is that the earth goes around the sun.
That's it?
That's it. But can you see where this is coming from? 500 years ago, that was a state secret.
Wow.
500 years ago, you could be burnt alive for contradicting the Catholic Church. So yes, 500 years ago, this was a major secret. And there are lots of those sort of, as it were, secrets within Masonry, but of course in the modern world they're not secrets at all. So in a way you can see how Masonry has lost its way in a way. It's lost its reason for being because we all know now, we're all Masons, we all know these major secrets. So yes, it's a society that is in some respects losing its way in the modern world. It's not relevant to the modern world as it was to the Victorian world.
Do you think they're trying to reform it at all? Will there be like a reformation of Masonry coming in the future, or is it going to stay
I don't know how can you reform it. You see, it's dying out. It's dying out in America and it's dying out in Britain. You know, within my lodge, the average age is about 75 years old, average. You know, we've only got to go another 20 years and our lodge is gone. Because they're all died out.
Yeah, what I'm finding, Ralph, is when I talk to Freemasons and people that are interested in it, and people such as yourself, is that they're finding more on their own than they're finding in the lodge, and they get bored quickly with what's going on there, and that's why maybe you haven't pursued all the other degrees. You're doing your own thing.
Yeah, because the secrets aren't there. You know, you're promised big secrets, and I don't see anything major. What I see is a very well-formed and very well-run golf club that has a very, very, very long history, and it's a superb gentleman's club for going out and having a meal and chatting about things off the record, as it were. You're not supposed to talk about politics and religion, but that doesn't seem to stop people. So if you want to talk to people of one particular section of society in relatively closed and guarded circles, then it's an ideal club, but not very much different to going to your local golf club, I wouldn't say. Where again, if you go to a golf club, it tends to be one type of, person mainly, and probably the structure is very similar to being in Masonry. But as to big secrets of the universe, no, I don't really think. I think they've lost them. Probably it did have, maybe in the days of the Knights Templar or something. But I think in the modern world, I don't think really they've got very much left, I think.
What's up next with you, Ralph? You just wrote Jesus, King of Edessa, and it seems like you're very methodical in your research, and you're basically on a progressive. It seems like you're now in the New Testament and heading towards Rome and going to tackle them next.
Well, I'd like to tap into this Arthurian legend more and see if I can discover Jesus more. I'm not sure if you've read this. We certainly haven't discussed it on this particular program. But the end result of this war in Judea was that Jesus was exiled. He didn't die there. This is why he survived the cross. But that gave Vespasian, Emperor Vespasian as he was then, a bit of a problem, because what do you do with this rebel prince, king, who had tried to take over the east of the Roman Empire but failed? For many reasons, they couldn't kill him because he had too many influential friends. And anyway, he was supposed to be, as it were, almost a son of God sort of thing. And it would definitely upset the locals a great deal if he had been executed. So what do you do with this guy? Well, the answer was that Vespasian set up a Guantanamo Bay in the 1st century. And he did it very much the same as they did with Guantanamo, in the most inaccessible place they could possibly find. And as far away from his power base as possible. So his power base was in Judea. And where in the Roman Empire is as far away from Judea as you can possibly get? Well, the answer is England, because it had only just been opened up in the AD 40s. And so they built this great prison fortress in northwest England, as far as you could go out towards the west, on the borders of Ireland almost. And they built this prison fortress, which is in modern Chester, which is a bit strange. Why have this prison fortress? And it was built, of course, just after the Jewish revolt. It was built by Vespasian. And the thing that struck me about this particular fortress was it had a temple in it, which fortresses don't normally have. Fortresses don't normally have temples inside them. But this one had a big temple. It was the finest building in the whole of England at the time. And it's very strange, because it is a Vesica Piscis. It is the sign of Pisces. And it's the only one in the whole of the Roman Empire. Now, who in this era was venerating the sign of Pisces? Who was the fisher of men? Which religion adopted the fish as its primary symbol? Which leader of which religion still wears the fisher ring even to this day? It's Christianity, of course. So this is a temple dedicated to Pisces. This is actually it's a temple dedicated to the whole of the zodiac, but specifically to Pisces. It's the first. You can't really call it Christian because it's Nazarene. It's not Christian. This is the Church of Jesus, not the simple Judaic Church of Saul. This is the first Church of Jesus to be built anywhere in the world. And it was built in England, in Chester. So the obvious conclusion is that Jesus was actually exiled to England, where he would have spent the rest of his life, seen out his days in a prison fortress. So there are lots of possibilities for picking up the history, the bloodline of Jesus over in northwest Europe in England.
And we know the Romans were there for several centuries because the history is there.
Oh yes, they were there until 400 about 420 or so AD. They were there for another 350 years.
Yeah, and then we have the history of the Anglo-Saxons, which is another story, another episode.
Yes, that's after Rome fell. But the interesting thing is that we have another legend, like the chansons of William of Orange. We have very similar songs, chansons, which is called Arthurian legend, which comes out of this same location. And Arthurian legend is very strange because we don't know who this guy was. Who is Arthur? People say...
But he's definitely probably, just like King Jesus, you definitely think there's a real king there and you're trying to find who that is.
Yeah, well,
okay.
Let's think about it for a minute. He wasn't a 6th century king, because most of the legends of Arthur, if you read the Vulgate cycle, most of Arthurian legend tends to put him into the 1st century AD. And a lot of the legends are a bit strange, because there's one particular one that I always come back to where they're having this battle with this king called Agripps, and this is in Wales, and there was so little water that this castle only had one well, and they poisoned the well, and they had to surrender because they had no more water. And you're thinking, in Wales? You've got to be joking. You've only got to put a spade in the ground and a river will come out of it in Wales. Doesn't make much sense, does it? What this was is a story of Judea. These are stories from Judea that have been planted into an English setting, but they're not. So the King Agripps was actually King Agrippa, and this is a story about the 1st century AD in Judea, which has been transplanted. And what has happened is that they had a very special king in England, a very special king, but you weren't allowed to talk about him, because if you talked about him, you would be put on a fire and burnt to death. And that was King Jesus, of course. You were not allowed to talk about it. If you wanted to say that King Jesus survived the cross and he was stuck in a prison fortress in England, that was pure heresy. You would be killed for that. So you couldn't mention it. But you could talk about Arthur, this wonderful king, who was the great king who would restore, the world, as Arthurian legend tends to say.
Almost like an updated version for that time of that warfare with the Anglo-Saxons and so forth. It was almost like updated and created specifically for them.
Yes, but it was recreated based on the knowledge that Jesus was actually there. So the battles that Arthur was having were not battles in England. This was a story, a reproduction exactly, of the Jewish revolt. But you couldn't say it was the Jewish revolt, because you're not allowed to say that Jesus was involved in the Jewish revolt. And you're certainly not allowed to say that he was alive and living in England. But you could merrily talk about Arthur and his battles with King Agripps and whoever. It's just a retelling of the Jewish revolt set in a northwestern European setting. So all of the Arthurian legend is based on the life of Jesus, and Arthur is Jesus. They are the same person. And the reason they chose the name Arthur, well, A, they had to give it a different name. You couldn't say this guy was Esus. Otherwise, that would be giving the game away again. You'd be stuck on a nice big fire. So they had to find a different name for this king. So what name to choose? Well, the name they chose was actually very ingenious indeed, because the whole basis of the Nazarene religion, the religion of Jesus, was the zodiac, and as I said before, astrology, looking at the heavens, looking at the passage of all of the planets and the constellations. And so the primary symbol of their religion was the zodiac, which is why if you go to Judea, and they've done quite a lot of archaeology there recently, and they've uncovered 6 now, I think, synagogues where the floor of the synagogue has a big zodiac on the floor. And the Jewish rabbis keep saying, no, they're not synagogues, they're not synagogues. And the archaeologists saying, yeah, well, actually they are synagogues, it says so on the floor. So what we have is early Judaism, and in this case I would say Nazarene Judaism, venerating the zodiac. And this is quite evident from the New Testament, of course. The New Testament is all about Jesus and the 12 disciples, the 12 constellations of the zodiac. And the last scene, really, the big major scene we have at the end of the New Testament is of Jesus at the Last Supper table with his 12 disciples. And as it happens, if you read Arthurian legend says that the first table of Joseph of Arimathea, again we're talking the 1st century, because Joseph of Arimathea came to England, of course, according to Arthurian legend. The first table that was set up by Josephus of Arimathea was a round table with 12 knights around, and the head of the table was Joseph himself, of course. And the Arthurian table was based on that first table. So there is a succession of tables here. We have the Last Supper table, and Josephus's table, Joseph of Arimathea's table, was based upon this. And that was a round table as well. And the Arthurian table was then based on that. So it was based on the Last Supper table. And so the Arthurian table, the round table, was not a table at all, of course. It was a zodiac. And that's why you have Jesus and the 12 disciples. You have Joseph and his 12 knights, and you have King Arthur and his 12 knights, all around the circular table.
They would represent the sun.
The constellations. So Arthur is the sun, surrounded by his 12 constellations. Jesus is the sun, surrounded by his 12 disciples, all around the round table, which is the zodiac. So each of the disciples would have represented one particular sign of the zodiac.
Yeah, what's interesting as well, I've researched this, it might tie into the research. They had birthmarks. I don't know if you found that Esus or Jesus does. I know King Arthur did, and then also Muhammad. They all have these special birthmarks.
Well, I'm not sure about birthmarks, but Jesus, according to the Talmud, was famed for having a tattoo. And this was a very special tattoo because it held the name of God. And it was this tattoo that gave him his power. So I'm not sure if they're talking about the same thing, but yes. Yes, he had a skin marking, which was said to be a tattoo.
Interesting.
Yes.
And I know tattoos back then were very popular, and tribal identity, everybody pretty much was tattooed back then.
Yes, obviously we don't know what tattoo it was, but that's what the Talmud says.
Wow.
So yes, so we have this zodiac, and we have Jesus in the center of this zodiac, who is the sun. And that is actually how you depict a zodiac. I mean, if you look at the one, there's a very good one in my books. It comes from the Sea of Galilee, just from south of Tiberias. And there is a wonderful zodiac there with the 12 constellations. And in the center, of course, is Helios, the sun, because that's how you set up a planisphere. That's what a planisphere looks like. So Jesus was the sun character at the center of this zodiac, which is why he has the rays of the sun coming out of his head, the halo, of course, because he is the son of God, as it were. He is
kind of the son of the sun, representative on earth.
Of course.
The light.
So he is a representative of the sun god, but that's how you represent this on a zodiac. But there are two ways of looking at a zodiac. You can either have this sun-centered zodiac, so you're looking down onto the solar system from above with the sun in the center and all the constellations of the zodiac running around the outside. Or you can stand on the earth and look up at the stars, look up at the celestial pole and all of the constellations running around you while you're standing on the earth. And you can represent a zodiac in that fashion as well, or a planisphere. The interesting thing about that is if that you take that reverse zodiac instead of the solar zodiac, what you get in the center of the zodiac is not the sun, you get Ursa Major there instead. And what's Ursa Major? Ursa Major is the great bear, the great Arthur, because that's what Arthur is named after, the great bear. And so in a zodiac, you can either have two people. You can have the sun, the Jesus character, or you can have Arthur. And that's why he became known as Arthur.
Interesting. So you're planning a book on King Arthur next, or?
Yeah, I want
sure.
to,
Okay.
I don't know how much there is within Arthurian legend that will allow this story to spread. But normally when I start researching something, normally the information sort of starts surfacing. So I hope it will, and I hope I get enough time to be able to research it.
Yeah, Ralph, and when I look at your work and, of course, the progression and then talking to you, for the first time for 2 hours, and then I've listened to several interviews, it seems like it's built into you.
Yes.
That you're in, of course, researching, but it's an intuition. It's something that's inside of you that's coming out as well. Like it's old knowledge that's new knowledge that you're, of course, fascinated by, and this is your life's work. I assume you're going to probably do it until the last day of breath, until you die.
I imagine I probably will. I'm a pure atheist, so I don't believe in the spiritual world. But I know what you mean by this is inbuilt, because everything to me just seems so obvious. And I can't understand why other people cannot see it. I only had to browse the books of Josephus for about a week before I understood that Josephus must be Saul. It just seems so obvious.
You're an atheist, correct?
Yeah.
So
Yes.
do you believe in DNA science and research?
Oh, yes. Well, you mean in terms of normal science? Yes, of course.
So that's what I believe is happening with people such as yourself and myself. Is it's built into us. It's in our DNA.
Well,
We actually come from these places where it's part of who we are.
It's possible, because DNA is a wonderful molecule that codes for an awful lot of information, and it carries an awful lot of more information than we actually know that it's using to encode for our bodies. So there is a lot of junk DNA there that we don't really know what it actually does. And so, that's one of the big areas of research at present, is looking into what on earth all this junk DNA is for. And you could code for an entire encyclopedia within that junk DNA. There's so much of it.
Yeah, and that's, again, another subject in itself.
It is, yeah. But we know that you can encode information into DNA. You can encode thoughts into DNA. You can encode knowledge into DNA. And we know this because of the monarch butterfly. And can you imagine how small the brain is in a monarch butterfly in comparison with what we have? And yet a monarch butterfly will be born and grow up and know where to go to when it's never been there before. Because, and if you know, the cycle of the monarch is quite amazing. It starts in somewhere in Mexico somewhere, and it runs up to sort of the borders of Canada, and then it goes back down again for the winter. But no one butterfly can make that journey because they don't live long enough. So it takes 3 or 4 generations to go up there and come back again. So how do the ones who are born in Canada know where to go back to? And they all go back to the same place. They can only know where to go back to if that information is actually encoded, not as we would do it, within MEMS, as we call it, memories, which is a social event, talking to each other. But it's encoded instead into the DNA. It's the only way.
Yeah, they actually, my house here, Ralph, they come here every year.
Oh, you see them. You know the cycle better than I do. And
the same tree
yeah.
They come to.
And so how do they know that? They don't have a society. They don't have
books or an internet, right?
Yeah,
no GPS.
They can't look it up. So it cannot be carried within MEMS, which is what we call the passing on of memories within society, within people. They can't do it that way. The only way they can carry the information is within the DNA. So yeah, the DNA can encode for memories, as it were, within yourself. So yeah,
and that's my theory, Ralph. Is we're returning home.
Yes.
Is we're those children that are spread out and finding the truth, because we know a lot of what we've been taught growing up wasn't this truth. So it was out there, but until it's like Albert Einstein had said, once you stop school, your education starts.
Yeah.
So it's...
And I knew this from a very young age as well. I rejected what I was being told when I was 7 years old. And I just
Me too, Ralph.
I knew it was rubbish then. Yeah. And that's before I actually knew anything about these subjects. I just thought, I don't believe any of that.
Yeah, you just despised it. You just knew something was wrong. And then once you knew that,
yes.
You just felt you didn't trust people.
Yes, absolutely. And I saw the power base that it was forming, even when I was in infant school. And, of course, in those days, we all had an assembly, which was a religious assembly. You're not allowed to do that in America. You're supposed to be secular, of course. But in Britain, we used to have a church service at the beginning of every school day. And so we're all there in the assembly hall, and everyone is heads bowed, of course, saying the prayers, except for me, who's staring up, and the headmistress, who is staring back. So we get the 2 eyes meeting across the assembly hall, with her looking daggers at me and me looking daggers back again. And I was only 7 years old at the time. And I thought, I know what you're doing. This is all about control. So yes, that started this many years ago.
Great, Ralph. It's been, we're going on 2 hours now, and
well, there's 2 sessions for you.
No, this is actually, I'd like to talk to you again in the next couple months, because you're a fascinating interviewee, and again, I've listened to you on other shows, but you learn something new every time
yes.
when you talk to you. Your books, you said 11 of them?
Yeah, I've got 2 on the pyramids
Okay.
as well. I've never talked really about the pyramid ones yet. I must do that at some point in time.
Actually, I would like to schedule a show in the next coming months and just talk about Egypt and
Yes, we can do
that
that.
era.
Yes, I don't talk very much about the Egyptians one. They've been eclipsed by all of the religious books which have overtaken them, but they're interesting in themselves, so that's probably worth talking about, yes. So we've got, the main series is the Egyptian Exodus series. That starts with Jesus, last of the pharaohs, and goes up through Tempest and Exodus. Eden in Egypt, Solomon, Pharaoh of Egypt, and I suppose you could throw into that, Scota, the Egyptian queen of the Scots.
Great, and all these books, they could download on Kindle or iPad and get them on your website.
They're all on ebooks now, and that's the better platform to do it, because of course books like this, they get updated, and so you get the latest edition. Plus, it's much easier to search and everything. I think they're a very good format for this sort of book.
No, I agree. This alternative history, I talked to several people and they're doing similar but different work, but they're saying ebooks are the thing because they can update them when new research comes along and then pass that along to the people that have bought their books. And
absolutely. It's like buying an app. You just don't buy one app. You buy an app for life and you keep updating it, and that's what it's about.
Definitely. And they could find you at edfu-books.com.
That's me, yeah. So there's quite a lot of information on the site. There's a few articles there, and it gives you directions to look for the books. If people like paper books, there are still some paper books available. Most of them come out of Adventures Unlimited. Do you know Adventures?
No, I don't.
David Hatcher Childress. He's up in Illinois. And he's also down in Sedona as well, down in Arizona. Anyway, he does a lot of esoteric books. If anyone is interested in esoterica, go to Adventures Unlimited of Illinois. And he's got all of this esoterica type books, plus all of mine, because he prints mine as well. And something I like that he does as well is he prints a lot of just old books. So the Victorian era was very good for producing lots of very solid esoterica or good alternative research. They weren't so afraid of going outside the boundaries in that era. So if you want sort of offbeat Egyptian history, there was a lot more of it available in the Victorian era than there is now. And
no, I agree, Ralph. I've been finding some great research in that era, definitely.
Which is really good. But what David Childress does at Adventures Unlimited is he just gets these books, copies them, and reprints them. Most of them, I think they're sort of like a photocopy or whatever. Reprint, and he just reprints them, and it's really good because you can get some really strange books that haven't been printed for 100 years, and he'll have them. So it's all good stuff.
And I know research, you do so much on a computer. It's great to have the book and kind of go back and forth, and you only could sit in front of the screen so long too.
With these books, they're just not on the net because they're out of print, because the publisher isn't around anymore. There is no one to actually formally go and put them on to the net. So unless someone from Google has actually got the book from somewhere and actually done it themselves, these books don't get onto the net. So there's a lot of stuff out there that you won't actually find on the internet. So you have to go and look for the old books. Yes.
Yeah, I'm actually going to check that out myself. And it was great talking to you, Ralph.
It was great to be on the show. I hope your listeners enjoy it, and perhaps maybe also later we might do a sort of question and answer session. That's always good with listeners.
Yeah, I'm going to start doing some live sessions, so if you're up to it, what we could do in the next couple of months, we'll schedule that. My website's been getting a lot of traffic, and I know there's a lot of people that are interested in the open forum. I've been getting emails for that.
Yes, so that's always another possibility. So yeah, there's demand for that. Why not?
Definitely, Ralph. Again, great talking to you. You could find Ralph Ellis at edfu-books.com. You could find all his work there, and I'm looking forward to the new books in the future, King Arthur and it's been great talking to you. We'll talk to you in the future.
Thanks very much.
Okay, Ralph.
Thanks, Molly.